Hi, boys and girls. You made it to Friday. Congratulations. Next week's spring break. Today's your last day of online learning until you get a big old break. So good job on that. All right, so if you've already finished your select and connect for your last 5 words, then you're ready to hear chapter 11 of Orphan Train Rider. I'm going to go ahead and read it to you. But if you want to read along, you can minimize this screen and you can go to the materials, and I loaded this up for you so you can look back at it, refer to it later when you're doing your flip grid, and follow along with me if you want to. So I'm going to go ahead and read to you chapter 11, which is the final chapter of the book. I hope you've enjoyed this book as much as I like this book. And then pay attention because you're going to make a flip grid, sort of like a Socratic circle discussion when this is over. So pay really close attention. Here we go. Chapter 11. It's called Lee Loses One Brother and Finds Two More. Ben and Ollie Nailing were patient people. They were willing to give Lee all the time he needed to settle in and feel at home. After a few fights at school, which earned him the respect of the other boys, Lee started to make friends. Soon he had the run of the village and plenty of playmates. The Nailings gave him a pony and let him keep the dog that followed him home one day. Gradually, he turned into a Texan. I got teased a lot because of my New York accent, Lee recalls. I would be saying "yous guys" while everyone around me was saying "y'all" in a strong Texas accent. I picked up the Texas way pretty quickly. Along with a new accent, new friends, and new pets, he got a new name. When he was born in 1917, his parents named him Alton Lou Clement, and he had always been called Al or Alton. Ollie Nailing strongly disliked a New York politician named Al Smith. No son of hers, particularly a son who came from New York, would be called Al. Ollie thought Lee's middle name was Lee rather than Lou, so she asked her new son if they could call him Lee Clement Nailing. Lee agreed, and that is the name on his adoption papers. After a while, Lee got over his desire to run away. The Nailings made sure he saw his brothers as often as possible. The three families arranged for the brothers to spend part of each summer together, first at one house, then the next. They did that until the brothers grew up. I didn't want to admit it, but I liked my new home, Lee says. As for my new parents, well, they took me to their hearts. In their eyes, I was their son. They'd never had children, and I think they really did consider me a blessing from God. But sometimes Lee would think about what happened to him, and the old bitterness would return. If Ben or Ollie tried to talk to him about his past, he would become silent. For years, I felt like something was missing in my life, Lee says. I had a wonderful family in the Nollings, but I often wondered about my biological family. Leo didn't seem troubled by it, and Gerald was so young that he didn't remember anything about New York. Not me. The lost pink envelope worried me for years and years. I often dreamed of finding my family. I thought I'd look up one day and see my biological father coming toward me to take me home. That thought never left me. But even though I was still angry at the whole world for what had happened to me, I couldn't hold out forever. My new parents gradually wore me down. I not only learned to love them deeply, and call them mom and dad and mean it, but I also gained a wonderful grandmother and assortment of aunts, uncles, and cousins. The little town of Manchester turned out to be the best place in the world to grow up. When Lee arrived at the Nailings' house in 1926, he was scared, bitter, and grieving for his family. He thought all adults were untrustworthy. Over the next few years, he became outgoing and friendly, good at his schoolwork and at sports. He stayed in close touch with Gerald and Leo. He grew up working hard in his parents' store and on the farm. His father also owned the local grits mill, and every Saturday, Lee helped with the hard work of grinding corn into meal by running the heavy grinding machine. He loved his adoptive mother for her kind heart, her strong religious beliefs, her talent for cooking, and her loyalty to her family. He loved his adoptive father for his sense of fair play and justice and his determination to raise Lee well. After Lee graduated from high school, he went to business college in Dallas. While living in Dallas, he fell in love with a young woman named Novel. They were married in 1939, and a year later their daughter, Jerry Lee, was born. By 1944, Ben Nolling had died, and Lee was helping Ollie run the family business. Novel was pregnant with her second child, but World War II was raging throughout Europe and the South Pacific, and Lee was drafted into the Army. Gerald, who had grown up tall, handsome, and good natured, had volunteered for the army several years earlier and was stationed in the Philippines. Leo had also joined up and asked to be sent to the South Pacific in order to be near Gerald. Then came terrible news. Gerald had been taken prisoner by the Japanese. Lee was in military training at the time, and he and Novel were getting to know their new son, Lee Nailing Jr. More bad news came. Lee was being sent to Europe. Having to go overseas when all I wanted was to be with my family was sure tough, Lee says. It was too much like what had happened to me as a child. Once again, I had no control over my life. This time I felt like I was a prisoner of the government. In 1945, just as the defeat of Germany was certain, Lee was assigned to help guard a German prisoner of war camp. It troubled him that he was guarding German prisoners while his brother Gerald was a prisoner of the Japanese. Lee knew how hard the lives of war prisoners were. I was afraid every day for him, Lee says. While Lee was still in Germany, the family received word of a tragedy. Gerald had been on a Japanese prison ship when it sank by sailors on an American submarine who did not know the American prisoners were on board. The little brother whom Lee had cared for on the Orphan train was dead. Lee returned from World War II unharmed, but grieving for Gerald. He became a food store manager, and he and Novel devoted themselves to their children. They also took care of Ollie Nailing in the years before her death. The family settled in Atlanta, Texas, a town of 6,000 near the village where Lee had grown up. He was active in the church and local organizations and was honored by the Chamber of Commerce as Man of the Year for many years for the many ways he had helped his town. After Lee retired, he and Novel remained involved in volunteer groups, visited back and forth with Leo and his family, and enjoyed their grandchildren and great grandchildren. Their daughter, Jerry Lee, married J.R. Loomis. Lee Nailing Jr. married Jeannie Warren, and they became the parents of Brian, Teresa, and David. Brian and his wife Dawn now have a son named Christopher. Teresa, inspired by her grandfather's story, adopted a little boy named Joshua. Then, in 1984, when Lee was 67 and thought life could not hold any more surprises for him, he got one of the greatest of all. After a story about him appeared in the newspaper, Lee received a letter from a man who had been friends with his older brother Fred. The man said that Fred had recently died, but that Lee's oldest brother Ross was in Florida. Included in the letter was a phone number. Lee immediately dialed the number. In his Texas accent, he asked if he was speaking to the Ross Clement who used to live near Watertown, New York. He was. The voice with the New York accent belonged to his big brother. Ross told Lee that both he and his sister Evelyn had tried to find him, Leo, and Gerald. At different times, they had gone to the Children's Aid Society, only to be told that the children had been sent far away and there was no way to trace them. Ross said that Evelyn was dead too. After the family split up, he and Fred had grown up together on the streets. Fred had not had children, but he had taken great pleasure in paying for summer outings for several orphans every year. We used to run into our father once in a while, but he barely acknowledged us, Ross told Lee. He was a broken, bitter man when he died, and as far as we know, he died alone. I have to tell you, Lee, I just think he was no good. Otherwise, he wouldn't have given up all us kids. Lee was not ready to agree with that. That day he gave me the pink envelope, Leo remembers that Dad was crying. I think he really cared about us. I often wonder how it would have changed things if I hadn't lost that envelope. Ross said that George, the baby brother who had been taken by family friends after the death of their mother, still lived in New York. Then Lee told Ross about Leo, and he had to tell Ross that Gerald had died in the war. Of the original family, Evelyn, Fred, and Gerald were dead. But Ross, Lee, Leo, and George were alive, and they wanted to get to know each other. Lee and Novel's children, Jerry Lee and Lee Jr., organized a reunion. People heard about it, many of them learning about orphan trains for the first time. And the Chamber of Commerce planned a party for the brothers. On Memorial Day, 1984, a car pulled up to the Nailing home. Lee stood by the window watching it. He had been unable to sleep the night before because he was so excited. I'm not sure I can explain my emotions, he said. I wondered if Ross and I would feel any kind of bond, if we would know we were family. I guess what worried me was that there wouldn't be any feeling between us. He saw a small man with wavy white hair get out of the car And then he ran out the door and down the walk to throw his arms around the brother he had not seen in 60 years. It was wonderful, Lee says. No one can imagine the feeling. This was my brother, and I loved him. The moment of knowing that is frozen in time for me. George and Leo and their families soon arrived, and the brothers spent the weekend getting to know each other. Those were some of the happiest days of my life, Lee remembers. Ross died a few years ago, and I'm very grateful I had some time with him. I feel so lucky to have found him. George and I are in regular touch, and I often see Leo since he lives nearby. Lee frequently speaks to school children about his experiences as an orphan train rider. He shows children the scar on his arm where the boy at the orphanage stabbed him with a fork as he reached for a biscuit. He tells them about the pink envelope and about being separated from Gerald and then being taken away from Leo when they got to Texas. He tells them about the dead chicks. Sometimes, when he has finished speaking, children will come up to him to talk about problems in their lives, fathers who don't live with them, or mothers who drink, or money troubles that keep their families moving around. Lee tells them their attitude toward what happens to them is the key to their lives. I was bitter for a long time, he says to them. I let that bitterness eat at me, and it wasn't good for me. I was fortunate to get loving parents who were able to help me put away the bad things that had happened to me so I could focus on the good. But I have met many orphan train riders who had terrible things happen to them and who didn't get good families, and on their own they determined to have good lives, and have done that. You can too. In 1994, Lee received an award named for Charles Loring Brace from the Orphan Train Heritage Society. It is given each year to a rider who has helped people learn about the orphan trains. Lee is proud of the award. He believes that Americans should know about the orphan trains and their role in history. When Lee looks back on his life, he believes himself to be one of the luckiest orphan train riders. I've always felt that I had a guardian angel watching over me, he says. When I got off that train in Texas, I was a bitterly unhappy little boy with a heart full of grief. The good Lord saw to it that I ended up with the Nailings. That was where I belonged. That's the end. There's a little postscript that gives a little bit more information if you want to know more about it. I can post that online too. All right, boys and girls, your question is, actually I'm going to give you two, so you can choose or you can do them both. The first question is, in your opinion, based on the stories that you've read about and the information you've gotten from Orphan Train Rider, do you think that the orphan trains were a good idea? Did they work? So you're going to use your information, your evidence, and you're going to go on Flipgrid with the link that I provided you, and you're going to make a short video, and it doesn't need to be more than 30 seconds, telling the answer to the question and the evidence that you use to support that. Okay? Do you think the orphan trains were a good idea? That's question one. Okay? Question two is, what do you think the purpose of the book is? What's the theme or the lesson that you could have learned? There's probably several, but which one stood out to you? What was a lesson you could have learned from reading this book? Maybe from the story of Lee and his brothers, or maybe just from the information. But theme is usually talking about a narrative. So we're going to look at the narrative of Lee's life. What can we learn from Lee and his life? So that's question number two. Question number one, were the orphan trains successful? Why or why not? Use evidence. Question number two, what is the theme of this book? What's the lesson that we can learn from reading it? Okay, so I want you to pick one of those two questions and go on, do a 30-second video. And then I want you to respond to two other Flipgrids. Okay, so give another 30-second video saying if you agree or disagree, if you want to add to what they think, use more evidence. Okay, that's what I'm looking for. Lots of evidence to support your point. Okay. All right. I think that's it, boys and girls. My last tip, don't take your fur vocab quiz until you've practiced. Okay. I've got a Quizlet link and I want you to practice with the games, the test yourself, do those things before you take the quiz so that you get 100%. I want everyone to get 100%. Okay? All right, guys. Have a wonderful spring break. I miss you all, and I will see you later. Bye.